Hello and welcome back. Our last video associated with the integumentary system. I'm going to kind of make this a catch-all. We've got parasitic infections. Hopefully I'll also get to yeast infections with this one, and pressure sores, which are decubitus ulcers. All right. So parasitic infections, these are going to be things like lice, ticks, mites that cause infection in the skin. Okay, so we had another video where I talked about viral and bacterial infections. Parasitic infections are another type of infection that can be associated with the skin. Fungal infections are another one that we'll cover. So fungus, typically we're talking about yeast or dermatophytes are the two associated with fungus. All right, so with our parasitic infections, I think I've got an example of lice, ticks, and mites in the PowerPoints. I want you to know what causes each of those. All right, with lice infection, we've got 3 types that can cause infection in the human body. All right. Again, we'll get into some sexually transmitted diseases here. Crabs are one type of lice that are associated specifically with pubic hair. That's where they tend to like to live. Okay? You can also have head lice associated with the scalp, all right, and body lice as well. Okay? The eggs associated with the lice are called nits. Okay? And that's where, especially with head lice, it gets really difficult to pull out all of the eggs associated with head lice. All right, you can see the lice squirming around there, and those can be picked off with a very fine-tooth comb. The nits are harder to get out, but again, have to be removed because once those eggs hatch, you're going to have lice associated with the head. Okay, typically, these are treated with medicated shampoos. There are, interestingly enough, now some lice that are becoming resistant to the medicated shampoos. With the lice, again, it's just a matter of being diligent enough to remove the nits and the lice itself from the individual. Okay? Again, typically not fatal, but causes a lot of itching. All right. So lice, ticks are our next parasite. All right. This is another parasite that's important here in New Mexico because we do have some ticks associated with the higher mountain regions. Areas like the Northeast in Pennsylvania, New York, where they have very wet environments, risk of tick infection is a lot greater. All right. With ticks, we've got 2 diseases that I want you to know. Rocky Mountain spotted fever is one tick-borne disease, and the infectious organism associated with the ticks, because the tick bites and transfers the rickettsia to the individual. Okay, so it's rickettsia, rickettsidae, I believe is how you say that. Need to check my spelling on this one. So that's our infectious agent associated with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This disease presents as, again, muscle aches, headaches, nausea, You can get some swelling, but the rash is what's key associated with that, with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. All right, but you also get headache, nausea, and the muscle aches are another key symptom associated with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. All right. Lyme disease is another tick-borne infectious disease. This is caused by a different infectious agent. I'm going to put it in a different color. It's going to be Borrelia burgdorferi. Now there's a mouthful for you as I check my spelling. Again, on the test, I'm not going to ask you to spell these. Rickettsia rickettsii, Borrelia burgdorferi. But I do want you to be able to recognize which infectious agent goes with which disease. So Rickettsia is Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And if the R's help you remember that, R to R, perfect. All right. Lyme disease is Borrelia burgdorferi, and it presents a little bit differently. Lyme disease, this is the one that is associated with the deer population. So this is going to be more common in areas where you have high deer populations because the ticks live on the deer. Okay? The Lyme disease is a little bit different from Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You get kind of a bullseye rash that's associated with it. So you can distinguish Rocky Mountain spotted fever from Lyme disease by how the rash presents. With Lyme disease, the rash presents kind of as a bullseye. You'll have a darker, redder area in the middle, some lightening, and then a ring around it, okay? And the individual can have just one bullseye rash, or if you're like my nephew who pulled a deer tick off of himself a couple years ago, ended up with like 30 bullseye rashes all over his body, all right? But typically what happens, again, with Lyme disease, this is one that occurs in stages, all right? You get the bullseye rash associated with stage 1. With stage 2, if the individual isn't treated, okay? Because again, these are going to respond well to antibiotics because you've got something that's infectious here, okay? I didn't include these under the bacterial infections because these two infections are transmitted via the tick. So you've got a go-between here with the disease progression. The tick has to bite the individual in order for the bacteria to get into the system. So that's why I've got these under parasitic infections rather than bacterial infections. But these do respond well to antibiotics. If Lyme disease is not treated, it can progress to meningitis, and it can progress to cause cardiac or heart disease for the individual as well, okay? But again, because it's something bacterial, can be treated with antibiotics, okay? Our last parasite that we've got, we'll continue with this with blue, just because I'm running out of board space so that you can see what goes along with the mites. Okay, mites are infectious here. This is commonly referred to as scabies with mite infections. Okay, they're related to spiders. And what happens with scabies? The mites lay eggs. On the skin. All right. And what happens, those eggs, once they hatch, they kind of burrow into the layers of the skin. Okay? So scabies, the larvae associated with the egg, burrow down into the skin. They tend to be small, and when you have a mite infection with scabies, you tend to see something very linear that comes out of it because of the way the parasite burrows into the skin. Okay? They tend to prefer areas like the hands, the fingers, in between the fingers, the toes. Also tend to infect genital regions as well. And with the treatment of that, you've got to get rid of the parasite itself. Okay? So with the mites, the difference between mites and lice don't ever burrow. They don't go into deeper layers of the skin. The larvae associated with mites, those burrow down in and can cause some other damage as well. Okay? Hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions, please let me know.